Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Now this week's episode is a bit different because we're actually responding to a listener's question, but more about that in a moment. My name is Julia Golding and I'm the director of the Oxford Centre for Fantasy and also a full-time writer. I sort of juggle the two roles. And today I am joined by a friend of the Oxford Centre, that is Jacob Rennaker. Now, Jacob is well known to us as a Tolkien scholar, but he also has had a little job shift since we last spoke. So perhaps, Jacob, you'd like to introduce in brief your new role, because it's very fascinating from a fantasy viewpoint.
So I'm working for Ravensburger that does publishing in children's books, games, puzzles, and whatnot. So, and a lot of what they deal with, if you've seen the Villainous board game, they have like Disney Villainous, Marvel Villainous, and forthcoming Star Wars Villainous. They have some games. They have a forthcoming actual Lord of the Rings puzzle book game that is tremendous. There's some serious care that's been put into making this. So I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. I think it's been announced publicly. If not, hopefully they're not listening. But there's something for this particular group to look forward to coming to stores near you sometime within the next year.
Yeah, that suggests another theme for us one day, which is about these crossover products, because of course it's famous that Star Wars, for example, made a fortune from its toy version. You know, so this sort of world where it comes out of a film or a book or whatever and becomes like a whole world and cosplay and all the rest of it is fascinating. Anyway, so what was the question we were asked and why have I brought Jacob back? Well, we got this rather cryptic message from a reader saying, what about the stone giants in The Hobbit? They're really wild. And I thought about that for a moment. I thought, yes, you are absolutely right. What about the stone giants? So if you haven't read The Hobbit for a while, they don't really impinge on the story very much. There is a sequence in the Peter Jackson film, which goes on for quite some time, with the sort of mountain rock people taking shape and then throwing stones at each other, and the Hobbit and the dwarves are all sort of at risk. But actually, where do they come from? I went back to the book just to check, and it literally says, oh, watch out, there are the stone giants, they're bad news, they're throwing rocks. No sort of sense of where their backstory is. So, Jacob, do you have a theory where the stone giants actually come from?
Yeah, that's funny. So I did some after. Thank you, dear listener, whomever you are, for that question. So that got me poking around, and so with The Hobbit, it's interesting, like you said, that they only kind of mentioned there as kind of a backdrop, right? That that they're mentioned in kind of the same breath as this really evocative imagery of two storms clashing, and so they kind of seem to be almost equated, synonymous with these kind of elemental, grand, almost cosmic forces. Or world-bound cosmic forces, and they don't appear again. There's other in the Hobbit itself. There's a few other passing references to giants that aren't stone giants, right? So this kind of the descriptor of stone in stone giants just only appears here, and I think I couldn't find anywhere else in Legendarium where stone giants were singled out, but giants here within the Hobbit itself, you have. Passing references to giants, like Bilbo wonders if this giant boulder that he sees in a stream was maybe thrown there by a giant at some point, but nothing is kind of fleshed out there. And Bladorthan says that he'd like to find a more or less decent giant. So there's kind of a moral dimension. There's decent versus indecent, I guess, giants. But largely these stone giants kind of seem indifferent, right? They're so massive in scale. They're not concerned with, they don't seem to notice Bilbo and company. And even if they did, who knows if they would care about these little, kind of minuscule creatures. So you do, I know, and this is, and we can go into this perhaps a little bit later. I'll wait for you to lead on this in Lord of the Rings, the idea of giants and how that kind of develops over the development of Lord of the Rings specifically as a story, but within the world of the Hobbit, this is kind of a almost a flash in the pan. You just kind of see this as a backdrop for this kind of adventure setting, with, like you said, that they don't play a significant role in the story, the development of the story, rather than to provide some sort of larger backdrop for the adventure against which the adventure is happening. Yeah.
I mean, they have the plot point of driving the Hobbit and the dwarves underground. I mean, that's what the purpose they serve is, to escape from these elemental creatures. They then get tangled up with the goblins. So you can see, you need an exciting turn in the journey to drive the dwarves somewhere they don't want to go. But I suppose there's also an association here, as you mentioned, with the storms of the elements. And it made me sort of connect it with the later iteration of a sort of sentient mountain. Because in the Lord of the Rings, or in the Fellowship of the Ring, they have the passage up Cadras, which is abortive because of the attack of the weather, which seems like a return in snow to the idea that somehow the elements can, in a neutral, not exactly neutral, but in a way that isn't involved in the battles of elves and men, can turn against travelers. And there seems to be some sort of correspondence there. Yeah, but I think just looking at their presence in The Hobbit, I mean, The Hobbit is a less tidy book in terms of the legendarium than The Lord of the Rings. So, for example, there is like the random reference to, is it Smaug dying like a screech of a steam train? It has a more storytelling awareness of our world element to it. And it has a more nursery feel. So it could be that there are elements that are just chucked into it to excite the reader, which don't have so much of a backstory. But I do remember reading that Tolkien thought he only had one reference in all of it, which he hadn't actually sort of plugged in properly, and that was the reference about the Queen and her cats that comes in Lord of the Rings somewhere. I think Aragorn mentions a past queen, and no doubt Tolkien went back and worked out what that meant. But I seem to remember him saying that was the only thing that wasn't connected. So maybe there are connections with the giants that we are missing. So let's dig a little bit more. So let's think about the giant, that figure in sort of world myth, before we come back to Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and people. So thinking back to the sources of giants, I came up with two main sources which I felt influenced Tolkien and also C.S. Lewis, and that was the Greek version and the Viking version. I don't know, which one do you feel you want to address first? Have at one of them.
Maybe so. Do either one. I went on a kind of deep dive into Norse.
Okay, let's
earlier.
Norse,
just kind of went down the Norse rabbit hole. But the Greek, Greek is easy. I think there are a lot of similarities, right, between Greek and Norse mythology in terms of giants and kind of the primordial nature, right? So, do you want? So Greek, I think Greek would probably take a little less time. Do you want to do Greek first?
Let's do Greek. Let's go Greek.
Greek, okay.
Cue music. Yeah.
So you have the Greek giants are children of Gaia and Uranus, and depending on which kind of founding mythology you're reading, they're either coming from when Uranus was castrated, right? They kind of bubble up from the blood from Uranus from that, or they're natural born to Uranus and Gaia, depending. So, some of the most massive, largest elemental figures, they're there, even side by side with the gods, or in some cases, seem to be in a grander scale in some sense, but they're largely strong, aggressive, and you have ultimately a kind of battle for power between the Olympian gods, the Gigantomachy, which this massive battle between the Olympians and the giants, and the Olympians end up winning. And there's sometimes
are these giants the same as Titans?
No, this is a different.
No,
Yeah, so
okay,
separate
let's clear that one out of the way.
Yeah. So giants. So these giants, in Greek literature, broadly speaking, and this is terribly reductive, but giants can be large, but also they don't have to be. So some people that are referenced as giants aren't necessarily giant size-wise, and in some instances appear to be kind of like mythical, kind of like half like some sort of divine mythical creatures, but not necessarily like 40 feet, 50 feet tall. They could be smaller. So, but that's in kind of like later literature and how they're dealing with quote giant. So I think typically I think of like the Cyclops in, say, like the Odyssey, as that's kind of what I picture as kind of being a giant. But they're of course like slightly separate, related, but I think slightly separate stream. It all gets muddled and muddied when you're looking at all the literature together as a whole, right? Because each of these authors is kind of taking a different piece of this and running with it. So yeah, so largely though, I think when you're talking about the earlier giants, the earliest giants that are battling the Olympians, and shortly thereafter, they're just kind of like brutes, and almost seem to carry this kind of symbolic weight of chaos, right? So the Olympians are these gods that are bringing in, reason, rationale, order to chaos, disorder, barbarism, right? And so that's kind of how sometimes it's used with later authors referring to this story of the Olympian gods versus the giants as kind of, in essence, representing this greater idea of civilization versus barbarism. Or Plato even references this as the giants kind of representing base materialism, or like materialistic ways of looking at the universe, whereas Plato, of course, is the correct way of looking at it, which is more abstract, right? Looking at some sort of transcendent realm, and that's where the Greek gods are representing. So at least in Greek literature, it's kind of the idea, the images are kind of abstracted and kind of taken to symbolize a battle between order versus chaos, civilization, barbarism, reason, rationale, and just kind of base materialism in some. So that's kind of the Greek, largely kind of why I see when I read it.
So, and obviously the Inkling authors all raised on Greek stories in the schooling system of the day, and I think one of the carry forwards there, which I can see, is the sense of them not being the sharpest of creatures, and I think that's particularly you can see that in C.S. Lewis's giants. He has a number of giants, some of whom are more benign than others, but that seems to me that he may be drawing on more of a Greek tradition. So let's do the Norse, where I suspect I can imagine Tolkien's fingerprints are slightly more visible. Right. I do remember that from the very foundational myths of Norse mythology, the physical world is made from the body of a giant.
Right.
So it is definitely
that's So Midgard. Right. Yeah. Which you have these overlaps, really interesting parallels in Mesopotamian mythology with the creation, with the Babylonians specifically, creation myth. But in Norse, you have, right. So yeah, Ymir. Please, somebody's going to. I daren't.
Apologies to those who can
apologies to anyone who does, to everyone who does Norse in any of its incarnations. But right, so this kind of primeval giant is the first being that actually exists in the world, right? That's kind of formed from drops of water when the ice of Niflheim meets the heat of Muspelheim. So you have, again, apologies for pronunciation, but so it's kind of in the middle of the, extra hot, extra cold, in the middle where that meets the watery area this giant kind of just develops out of. So, and then from his person or its person kind of develops, kind of grows other giants. So that's what you have that happening. And kind of at the same time, elsewhere, meanwhile, you have the original gods being created as well. So they're kind of two different tracks of kind of origins for the gods like Odin, etc. We would think of more traditional gods, Thor, etc. And then the giants that are kind of born directly from the body of this initial being that is the first to exist in this world. So yes,
and they battle it out, don't they? Those gods and the giants.
Right. Well, they're battling it out, and the gods that are the more kind of like human-like gods end up, slaying this primeval giant, and his blood drowns all of the other giants except for one family that survives on a little boat, and then survives. And it's the fashioning. The gods fashion the world from this deceased god's body and set up from the brow of this primeval god Midgard, right, which literally is Middle Earth, and it is meant to protect in some ways the inhabitants of Midgard from these giants who they're trying to push off to the periphery.
Okay, so we've got a wide range of giants there, and just thinking about the sort of trickle down effect when we look into the sort of world of medieval stories, another fascination for Tolkien and Lewis in particular. You get versions of these giants in new forms coming forward. And I think the one that obviously we know is a direct influence is Gawain in the Green Knight. The Green Knight is a giant, but he is a giant in the sense of the stature of one of the Greek ones. He's not that huge, but he's not dim. He's elemental. He's clever. He's a force of nature. He's magic. He's scheming. So he's an absolutely fascinating figure, I think, as a sort of interpretation of the giant as the other that threatens the world of the court and the knight civilization. But he's offering a different kind of civilization in his green chapel. So I think that's a really fascinating giant, and probably my favorite of all the giants, because he seems to have so many aspects to him.
Yeah, agreed. No, the Gawain and the Green Knight is a fascinating story in and of itself, right? And when we know, of course, that Tolkien specifically, there's actually a letter of Tolkien that's up for auction right now for anybody who's it's currently there. You can get it right now. It's at over $6,000 US right now. But it's a letter to a fan who's writing about Lord of the Rings, hadn't quite finished reading it, but what they had read had impressed them so much. Tolkien wrote a letter back, and he says that he's talking about the creation of Middle Earth, and he says, naturally in digested form, I am indebted to the myths and legends of literature, but most specially to those of England and Wales. For Gaelic of Ireland and Scotland, I have a great liking. So I think, so definitely looking at Gawain and the Green Knight, there's a special place in Tolkien's heart for this kind of Celtic Gaelic version of giants as it come there. And I think that's a valuable insight into, and especially do we have the Green Knight and some interesting connections to giants and Ents in Lord of the Rings.
So hold the thought about Ents, because you made a very interesting point about the actual meaning of the word Ent. We need to properly recognise the Mabinogion and the Irish legends. Again, Giant's Causeway. That's for those of you who aren't familiar with the sort of geography of Northern Ireland, there's a fantastic World Heritage Site called the Giant's Causeway, which is created by cooling basalt from an ancient volcano. And it's called the Giant's Causeway because it looks as though it's been made by a creature, a giant. And it links up geologically to Fingal's Cave over in Scotland. So there's a huge presence of giants in the landscape that is all over England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. And giants cut into chalk surfaces, everywhere. And any large structure is often named after a giant or a hero who is treated like a giant. So heroic people of that stature. So there's a very rich tradition there. And all of these masses of influences are all going into what Tolkien called the cauldron of story and being stirred around. So let's look at the specific mention of Ent, because this word isn't actually Tolkien's word, is it?
No, no, it's right. It's the Old English, often translated as giant itself. So Ent and giant in Old English appear to be synonymous or have a close affinity to each other. It's really interesting looking at how, the development of Lord of the Rings, the different drafts, that in early drafts you have references to giants, not frequently, right? So it seems that after The Hobbit, as he's putting together Lord of the Rings, you still have some references to giants, but upon successive revisions, they kind of get weeded out. And even Treebeard himself, right? So this idea of Ents, Treebeard in earlier drafts is described more or less like a giant who's kind of dressed in green or wearing, mail that looks like leaves, and he has a beard, like branches, but and then is described as having his own court with, some sort of courtly retinue, right? Who stand tall, who stand like young trees. So again, this is saying that they're standing like them, not so. There's some ambiguity there. Are they actually trees? But then, as it kind of develops, it seems like Tolkien is taking what was happening in what he was doing with the idea of giants, this kind of generic idea of giants as these large oafish creatures that you really get a better sense for in the Farmer Giles of Ham. The giant there for Tolkien is kind of this explicit, just dumb brute who's deaf and partially blind and just kind of bumbling, to then, and these passing references in Hobbit that seem to be connecting it to this wider world of children's, stories about giants and knights battling giants and that sort of thing. He then kind of takes that and it seems like he's trying to make it his own, giving his own personal kind of internally consistent idea of giants. And it seems, at least in my reading of kind of all this, preparatory material and multiple drafts, that he's kind of taking this idea of giants and developing that within the legendarium into Ents in some way. One aspect of giants kind of evolves into Ents.
Okay, so here's a theory, Jacob.
Yeah.
If in The Hobbit we've got stone giants, hyphenated stone giants,
yeah.
Maybe what we've got in Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, is wood giants.
Yeah.
So you can imagine there's a sense of he's working through the elements here. Because it's a very elemental landscape that we're moving in. So perhaps that's where we're going here with it.
You could, because you do have in Book of Lost Tales, there's references to Melko breeding giants in the earth along with other monsters, with the wicked dwarves, ogres, but that doesn't really he doesn't follow that trajectory, it seems. So we have giants mentioned in some of that earlier material, but it doesn't seem to survive as he's kind of working and reworking it. That he really seems fascinated with, like you're saying, that that kind of dimension of giants, the elemental giants that are kind of the green, the wood, and follows those and develops that, because he says that he doesn't remember creating Treebeard. And so this is something that kind of seems to be happening kind of organically, for lack of a better term, right?
Growing from a seed.
Right. But he didn't see, Tolkien didn't see himself as kind of like from whole cloth, kind of creating consciously this entity that is Treebeard as an ent, but then it kind of grows into this idea, which is which I find fascinating, because it is so directly tied to the landscape itself, right? That Tolkien was so particular about, and he writes, so movingly about, just in describing. He obviously cared about, right, trees, landscape, the world, and the Ents kind of become this vehicle for personifying, giving a voice to the land, right, to nature. And that's, it kind of grows, and then it becomes something that's distinct, that we see, like you were mentioning with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, that we see the Green Knight kind of having a tie to the green, right? The elements of wood kind of in particular. And so this is, I think, him perhaps, Tolkien leaning a bit, drawing a bit from that, but then kind of amplifying it 100-fold in his own the petri dish that is Middle Earth and the broader, right, legendarium.
I'm getting a bit carried away with my theory here, but I got another one to offer you.
Okay, keep going. I love it.
Yeah, so we got stone giants and wood giants. The Balrog is arguably a fire giant, because it's described as a sort of spirit of flame, isn't it?
Right.
It's one of those sort of elemental monsters created by the original Melkor Dark Lord, the super baddie. So where we've got that's earth, fire, and wood. We're doing quite well on our elements here.
Right, you can throw in the eagles if you want to do. You want to do eagles? You can go ahead and do that if you want for a looser connection too, right? So the air, right, that they're right in their manways, kind of the specific, affinity for manway, who's largely in charge of, right, the kind of the realm of air. So I think that works. I think you're onto something.
That's the next academic article. Not that I write those anymore. So I think what's really interesting is that in some ways, another argument here is that everything but hobbits are giants in Lord of the Rings, because our perspective, our point of view is of the small. So it means actually that the way it's positioned is that that we are going out into a bigger world, a world that doesn't care or understand the halfling, the hobbit. So even the men that we meet are a bit like giants to the hobbits. I mean, you see that obviously in the film with all the discussion about how they did the forced perspective and the doubling to make this clear. But you've got the sort of oafish giant people in Bree, and then you've got the sort of regal giants of the sort of Gondor people and people of stature and the elves. So you could say that there's this theme of perspective that runs all the way through Lord of the Rings, which reminds me very much of another literary antecedent, which is perhaps one of the first to make real use of this perspective, and that's, of course, Gulliver's Travels, which has the two worlds where Gulliver in one place is a tiny, and in another place he's the giant. So it feels a bit like that to me, that Tolkien's very aware of just how big or small you are in a fantasy world, because that's really the heart of being a giant, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. You do. Yeah. Absolutely. And then you have nuance added kind of to that, or kind of taken in different directions. And I think, and that's where, the giants kind of being used as metaphor. You see that in some ways I think here in Lord of the Rings, definitely, but also in the Chronicles of Narnia, and some of C.S. Lewis's other writings, where the idea of giant as metaphor for something different, and even into sometimes contemporary literature, which we can talk about shortly.
Yeah, let's turn to Narnia. So just off the top of my head, I could think of, there may be more, I could think of 3 giants. There's the first one that we meet in Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, who is turned to stone previously, and his giant Rumblebuffin, quite a cozy name, and he's the one who borrows the handkerchief to mop his brow. That's all, and he's obviously in the tradition of gentle but bit dim giants. Then the next one I could think of was the one who stands as a marshal in the fight between Peter and Miraz. And he is Wimblefeather, who seems a close cousin or descendant of the one from Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And then the most interesting giants, and the ones that connect most to the stone giants of the Hobbit, are the ones that pop up in the Silver Chair. There's a lot of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in this as well, with the wintry setting and the Christmas feast and all of this. But there is, when they're first introduced, they are behaving very much like the giants from the Hobbit, because we actually get the giants throwing stones. And Jill, who's called Scrub, says, "Are they aiming at us?" No, said Puddleglum. "We'd be a good deal safer if they were."
Right.
So these giants
terrible shots.
Terrible aim, terrible shots. Duffers in the sporting world of Narnia. But then, of course, the children then go into the castle where they're treated as guests, but it turns out a bit like a Jack in the Beanstalk sort of scenario, very much that kind of fairy tale feel, where they realise that they are the prime dish, not the guests for dinner. They are dinner. So that world to me seems as though C.S. Lewis is drawing on fairy tale giants, really. But the stupidity, the silliness comes from a sort of easily tricked element, comes from the sort of the Cyclops type giant. So there's sort of a bit of Greek in there as well. Have I mentioned them all? Have I missed a giant? Thank you for listening to part 1 of this week's podcast. Come back next week to hear part 2. Thank you for listening to Mythmakers.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.